My name's Mike Rucker, and I became involved in this automobile in 1987 when it became available for sale, and we were able to finally bring it back to Peoria several years later. But first I want to talk a little bit about the history of the Duryea brothers themselves, and then we'll talk a little bit more about this vehicle and others. Charles Duryea was born December 15, 1861 near Canton, Illinois. And his brother Frank was born October 8, 1869, about 8 years later. The family moved to a farm near Wyoming, Illinois, and there they went to high school, graduated from high school there. And while there, both of the brothers built bicycles. In those days, of course, bicycles had one large wheel and one small wheel. Charles built one from two wheels. One was a 42-inch wheel from a corn cultivator, and the other was a little wheel from a toy wagon. Charles then went to Giddings Institute in La Harpe, Illinois, and graduated from there, and then got a job as a bicycle repairman and assembler in St. Louis. And then from there, he moved to Washington, D.C., and he still worked as a bicycle assembler. But while there, he got a pass to the U.S. Patent Office, where he would go and study patents. So he learned very quickly, how important patents were. So he was very obsessed, really, with getting patents his entire life. Over their lives, Charles had 61 patents in his name, and Frank had 30. Most of those were relating to automobiles, but the early ones, particularly for Charles, were related to bicycles. In fact, his first patent was when he was in St. Louis. It was for a bicycle saddle. So from Washington, then Charles began to start his own bicycle manufacturing in Rockaway, New Jersey. And then he got another manufacturer to make his bicycles in Chicopee, Massachusetts, which is a northern suburb of Springfield, Massachusetts. And he induced Frank to come and join him there. And so they were making bicycles, but they began now to become interested in gasoline engines. In 1890, Charles was on a trip between Peoria, Illinois and Washington, D.C., and he stopped at the Ohio State Fair, and he saw a gasoline engine made by Benz of Germany, and it kind of fascinated him. And he thought, well, since Benz has already made an automobile, actually a three-wheel vehicle, powered by a gasoline engine, he became determined that he was going to do the same. So he started designing his gasoline engine while he and Frank lived in Massachusetts. And Frank was a great mechanic. He was a great tool maker and mechanic, and Charles was the one with the initial ideas. And so they worked and worked on it. And the main problem they had, however, in making it run is they did not have a carburetor to atomize the fuel, and they did not have a good sparking system to ignite it. So those are the two things that kind of held them back. So after quite some months of trying, they couldn't make the engine run. And so Charles, at this time, had a contract in Peoria here with a fellow named Rouse Hazard Company in Peoria Heights, to make his bicycles. And he was a designer of a very popular bike called the Sylph, S-Y-L-P-H. And so he came back here to work on that while Frank worked on the engine in Massachusetts. And finally, Frank was able to make it run. Charles had bought a used women's Phaeton buggy for $70 in 1890, and then Frank was determined to put the engine in it and make it run. And they had real problems. Their manufacturing shop was on the second floor of a building there in Chicopee, Massachusetts. And finally Frank made the engine run. He put it in the buggy, started it up, and it did indeed run. The only problem is he hadn't thought of brakes. They were so determined to make the engine run, but hadn't thought of stopping it. So they started up, and the vehicle started running straight towards one of the interior walls of a second-story building, and he and some workmen had to grab it and hold it back till they got the engine stopped so it didn't crash through the wall. Well, he knew he was ready to show it to the public. So in September 13, 1893, they took it down the elevator to the ground floor. They had to stand it on its two back wheels in order to get it down. They took it out, had it towed to the starting point they wanted with a horse, and he started the engine, and it ran 600 feet. Ran very well for 600 feet, and then the belt that was driving the rear wheels began to slip, and so he had to take it back to the shop, work a little bit more on the drive belt, and finally, a few days later, he was able to run on the streets and ran, I think, 6 miles on one of the very first trips. So they knew they had a good thing going. Now, during this time, Charles was here in Peoria, and he did not see it run, but Frank then made drawings of all the improvements he had made and provided those drawings to Charles. And Charles, knowing how important patents were, had them all patented in his own name and did not mention Frank, which is the first time, that the two brothers started having some difficulties in getting along. So from there, they decided to make a second car. Frank then made a vehicle. It was not just a horse-drawn vehicle, but one designed for the purpose of being, shall we say, an automobile. And he developed a new engine and put it in it, and then entered this car in the first automobile race in America. It was held on Thanksgiving Day, 1895 in Chicago on a very snowy day. There were 83 designers, 83 inventors who gave their fee, paid their fee to enter the race. But on that day, it was a cold, snowy day, only 6 vehicles showed up to actually participate in the race. 4 were gasoline powered, and 3 of those were powered by Benz engines from Germany. 2 of them were electrics, and 1 was the engine that Frank Duryea had designed. Of course, the electrics only got a few blocks of what they gave out, and the others gave out eventually, except for 1. 2 vehicles finished, and that was one of the Benz-powered vehicles from Decatur called the Mueller-Benz, and about an hour and a half ahead of him was the Duryea vehicle powered by Frank, and that was America's first race. So that was very significant. So from there, then the 2 brothers, Frank and Charles, cooperated to start the Duryea Motor Wagon Company in Springfield, Massachusetts. And this was the most significant thing about the Duryea brothers is probably they were the first to manufacture automobiles of the same type, advertise, sell them, and began the automobile manufacturing business. In 1895, Henry Ford saw the Duryea vehicle in Chicago, and he said that's the first motor vehicle he ever saw. And he said the Duryea automobile was the most significant thing that occurred in starting the automobile business in America. So they made, at this manufacturing company in Massachusetts, 13 vehicles, identical vehicles. 1 was bought by the Barnum and Bailey Circus Company, and they shipped it around in the train, and each time they had a parade, when they came to town, along with the elephants and the giraffes and whatever, the Duryea vehicle led the parade. So it was really quite a novelty at the time. Well, they sold their 13 vehicles, but they weren't making enough money to stay in business. So they sold the business, and then Charles came back to Peoria. That was in 1897. And he lived on Barker Avenue, and he built a shed behind his house to start working on prototypes for an improved vehicle. And he built 3 of them there in his shed behind Barker Avenue. Lots of complaints by the neighbors of the noise and fumes and whatever. And one of the vehicles he built was this 3-wheel vehicle here. He built 2 3-wheeled vehicles and 1 4-wheel vehicle there, and ran them on the streets and proved that they would work. This vehicle actually had a van body in the back. It was designed to be more of a work vehicle, and over the years that van body got lost. So he got some financing in 1899, when he built these vehicles, to have vehicles built in what's now Peoria Heights. So he contracted with a company called Seiberling Rubber Company, and they began to build in 1899. They began to build vehicles of this sort there in Peoria Heights. And he had 18 engine blocks cast. The unique thing about this vehicle is it has a 3-cylinder engine. It also has a good carburetor. It has a good sparking mechanism. It has a planetary, very unique planetary transmission, which Henry Ford got inspiration for when he built the Model T. And it also has pneumatic tires. The only other vehicle we know of that was made in Peoria Heights, or made here in Peoria area, is one at Henry Ford Museum in Michigan. The vehicle was originally purchased by a plumber in Reading, Pennsylvania, who owned it until 1930. He used it in his work until he wore the tires completely out. And then he gave it to the Museum of Science and Industry in New York. And it was there until it was purchased in 1971 by an automobile collector named Henry Austin. And then later it was bought by L. Scott Bailey, who was a automobile publisher, if you will. He started Automobile Quarterly magazine and other automobile magazines, became very successful at that. So he was a very significant collector of automobiles. Then he decided to move to England and sell most of his collection. So he contacted George W. May here in Peoria, who had written a book called Charles Duryea Automaker. And he had a copy of this book, so he knew that this vehicle had been made here, so he offered it to be brought back to Peoria for $125,000. So I got a call one day from John M. Parks, who was one of the founders of Wheels of Time Museum. And he said, Mike, you know, this vehicle's available. It's made in Peoria, it's significant. And I was president of the Peoria Regional Museum Society at the time. And he said, why don't you look into it and see if maybe, you know, we could raise the money to bring it back to Peoria. So I met with Mr. Bailey and drove the vehicle there with him, came back to Peoria and met with people at the Peoria Regional Museum Society and Wheels of Time, and they all said, let's do it. Yeah, we can raise the $125,000 and get this brought back to Peoria. So we started the campaign. I signed the agreement to purchase the vehicle, and we were off. So we're off to kind of a, you know, initial start, but then we kind of faltered a bit, and along came somebody who challenged whether this vehicle was made here in Peoria or not. And we had to prove it before we could start it up again. So the vehicle at that time was at Lakeview Museum. So I stopped the campaign until we could prove it. And the news of this controversy went worldwide. AP and UPS got it. It went all over the world. I even had inquiries from Australia and Singapore as to, you know, are you the Mike Rucker involved with this terrible controversy over where this car was made? Well, a close friend of mine was able to prove where it was made. Mel Moffat was his name. He worked for the library at the time. And he went to all the places this car had been and did the research, traced the ownership records of it, and we proved it was made here in Peoria. So we called the campaign back up, and by that time we had enough publicity and enough notoriety, if you will, that we topped the campaign off and had enough left over to start the Charles Duryea Engineering Scholarship. So that's how we got the vehicle back here and why it's here in Peoria Riverfront Museum.